Good evening, everyone. The mic is not here. There we go. Is this better? Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'd really like to thank you for being here for tonight's program in conjunction with our current special exhibition, A Better Life for Their Children. Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 schools that changed America. Photographs and Stories by Andrew Filer. I'd like to start by extending a special thank you to our exhibition sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Texas Instruments, whose support enabled us to bring this incredible exhibition to Dallas. We are incredibly grateful for their support. We also are grateful to our anchor sponsors, Bank of Texas, Debbie and Ron Green, and Match Group. And lastly, thank you to our partner sponsor, the Dallas Tourism Public Improvement District. I'd also like to thank our wonderful exhibition community partners. And bear with me, this is a longer list. Dallas After School, Friends of Juanita Craft Civil Rights House and Museum, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Preservation Dallas, Project Unity, Remembering Black Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress, Vogel Alcove, and Youth Revive. What an incredible group of sponsors and community partners. Thank you all so much for your support of the museum. We couldn't do this without you. Please help me thank them. As always, I'd like to thank our museum board members, our museum members, generations, and volunteers who are with us this evening. Your support helps us continue to offer programs like these. If you are new to the museum and would like to get engaged, please visit our website, dhhrm.org, to learn more about how you can get engaged. We need lots of volunteers, and we always need members. We are honored to host A Better Life for Their Children through August 17th. If you haven't yet seen the exhibit, it details one of the most transformative initiatives in American history, in which Jewish businessman and philanthropist Julius Rosenwald and Black educator Booker T. Washington built thousands of schools for Black children across the segregated South and Southwest. If you've not yet seen the exhibition this evening, I encourage you to do so, either staying after the program, the museum will be open until 9 p.m., or visiting the museum during our regular opening hours up through August 17th. Tonight's program, Education and Excellence, Preserving Rosenwald Schools in Texas, will examine the innovative educational practices that defined Rosenwald schools, while confronting the challenges of preserving them in Texas today. A Rosenwald school that illustrates this obstacle clearly is the Sand Flat School, located in Emory, Texas, a town in Rains County, about an hour east of Dallas. It began as an African-American farming settlement at the turn of the 20th century. In 1922, citizens constructed a new building, in part with grant money furnished by the Rosenwald Fund. The four-classroom, white-frame structure served African-American students until desegregation in the 1960s. It is still standing, but as I'm sure two of our panelists tonight will share, it has recently been determined that the building is beyond repair, which is heartbreaking. We look forward to discussing the Sand Flat School this evening, among the other Rosenwald schools throughout our state. I'd now like to introduce our featured panelists for this evening. Gwendolyn McMillan Law was born in Emory, Texas. Her educational journey began at Sand Flat School, followed by St. Paul High School, both Rosenwald schools. She is the author of From Wolf to Wolfwood, a genealogical and historical study of the McMillans and the African American communities of Emory, Texas. Among her many awards and organizational affiliations, in 2018, Law became the first Black female president of the East Texas Historical Association. Grover Thomas was born and raised in Emory, Texas, and began his educational journey at Sand Flat School from 1962 to 1969. It's always good to have people in the audience. Thanks to his educational journey, he spent 40 years working in telecommunications industry. Thomas is a proud U.S. Army veteran, an alumnus of Texas A&M University Commerce, and a graduate of Strayer University. And our final panelist is very well known to the museum. He's been on many panels here, Dr. W. Marvin Delaney, the Deputy Director of the Dallas African American Museum. He's also an Associate Professor of History Emeritus, former Interim Director of the Center for African American Studies, and the former Chair of the Department of History at the University of Texas Arlington. He has published and edited 4 books and is completing a history of African Americans in Dallas. That's what you're working on, so you can't come volunteer. I was recruiting him earlier. Lastly, our moderator, Bob Brinkman, is the coordinator of the Historical Markers Program at the Texas Historical Commission, in which capacity he has written 900 or so historical marker inscriptions for monuments across our state. That does deserve a hand. Yeah. Including one right here in Dallas for the beloved Juanita Craft House. Let's have another hand for that. Thank you. We will have time for questions at the end of the program, so please write your questions on the note card that you were provided as you entered. Our staff will come around and collect the note cards, and we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions as possible. I also ask that you silence your cell phones or electronic devices now so we may all enjoy the program without disruptions. And now, Bob, it's my pleasure to turn the discussion over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all of you for joining us. Why don't we get started? So, in the wake of the landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, the doctrine of separate but equal that was established by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 was struck down as unconstitutional, and that signaled a major victory for civil rights activists. A secondary ruling in 1955 addressed the implementation of desegregation, calling for it to proceed with, quote, all deliberate speed. These rulings came with an unintended consequence: the closing of schools built by and for African American communities, including nearly 530 Rosenwald schools across rural Texas, of which today we estimate less than 8% remain. What happened to the students who attended these vital institutions? Were they immediately welcomed into newly integrated schools, or was the transition slower and more complicated?
Immediately welcomed in? No. No. It was a culture shock. When you come from a school where you have, in one classroom, maybe 30 people in the entire classroom, and then you end up in a classroom where there's just 30 people, period. In the classroom with the 30 people, you had first, second, third grade. And then when the school's integrated, 8th grade and 30 people in the 8th grade. And it was a hard adjustment, because when the schools integrated in Rains County, they essentially kind of separated us per sex. There were girls' classes and boys' classes. And that hadn't happened before until the schools were integrated.
Well, to start with, my experience was totally different from his experience, because I went to what had been the white school the first year of desegregation. And to say that we were not welcomed, it kind of depends on what you're looking at. We had some young men that played football, ran track, basketball. They were welcomed immediately. before we went to Raines High School, that was the high school, there was a community meeting at the church. And I guess it was kind of an orientation for what we were to expect. And one of the things they told us immediately was that the girls could not be drill team or cheerleaders. But they didn't say anything about the football. And so the first year, the football players and all the other athletes participated, and so they were very welcome. It was then a time that they were really, to some extent, trying to make us feel welcome. Ms. Shiflett was the business teacher. She had a son that was in my class, which was the senior class. And she was always very inclusive. Senior activities, she wanted to always make sure that everybody was involved. But as you would expect, there were so many things that were separate the first year. The senior play, they wrote in a scene for the African American students. When they chose the senior favorites, my cousin Kenneth was most likely to succeed or something like that. And his counterpart, the girl that got that, they wouldn't put them on the same page in the yearbook. Every other group, if it was, for example, a most athletic girl, guy, they'd be on the same page. But the black and the white couldn't be on the same page. So it was just a lot of things, a lot of new experiences. But the one thing, I guess, that stood out, they didn't expect us to be on the same level that they were. And what they did to me, for example, they took my transcript, and the school that we came from, St. Paul, gave letter grades. Raines gave number grades. So if I had an A, it was a 95. They didn't know if I had 100 or 90, but it was 95. I graduated third in my class, but it was the way they did the grades, you couldn't tell if I was third or not. But I think they had some guilt because they always published in the hometown paper the valedictorians every year. That year, they published the top 3. So they did a lot of weird things. That first year, they did a lot of things. But overall, I think it was a learning experience for us, but probably more so for them.
I'd have to say that the two people we have on the stage are sort of exceptional because basically it varied across the South in terms of what happened after integration or desegregation. In that in many places they didn't accept the African American students, and I'll be a bit more detailed later. That is, they closed the Rosenwald schools. They closed the black schools. They fired the principals and the teachers that were in the black schools. And then in many cases, black students sort of had to wait until it made its way through the courts. And so, just broadly speaking, it varied across the South, but in most cases, they didn't accept the black students immediately into the white schools.
At the time, did you consider integration a chance for better opportunities for your generation of students and future generations, or did you notice an adverse effect on the Rosenwald schools or the other African American schools? Did they become neglected campuses, or as Dr. Delaney, as you say, there weren't enough jobs for all the teachers, and so guess who lost their jobs?
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. When schools first integrated that first year, I think, again, let me point out something. Gwen and I were, she went to St. Paul, which is high school, and so she was ahead of me. So her, like she said earlier, her experience was different from mine. When desegregation happened in Rains County, I was in the 8th grade. It was my first year. And 8th grade, whether you're desegregated or not, is a hard time. When you're early teen, is really tough. So going into desegregation into Rains High School just made it that much more difficult, I think. And I know a lot of the teachers that we had didn't really know how to relate. And I tell this one story because a lot of people will drop their jaws when I say this. We had one teacher who told racial jokes that first year, and I couldn't believe it. So, but growing up in Emory and out in San Flat, we were always taught to be respectful. And so, in a lot of ways, we said we just had to take it. So, but a better life, expecting a better life, seeing that as an opportunity at 12, 13, no, I didn't look at it that way.
I'd like to speak to that, but also comment on what Dr. Delaney said about the teachers. I saw what happened to teachers probably from a different viewpoint because my dad was a principal at San Flat. And when San Flat closed, he became the principal of the junior high school. And at that time, they hadn't gotten or hadn't accepted any black faculty. But he was the junior high principal. They gave him a secretary. First time he met the secretary and was going to do some work with her, she couldn't type. And so I had been his secretary since I was in about the 7th grade. So I had to continue being his secretary, although he had one. As far as teachers losing their jobs, because my dad was a principal, all of the small town principals knew each other. So all of his friends lost their jobs. And he hired his friends as substitutes. They were substitute teachers, but they had been principals. And many of them never found jobs after that.
Let me put some meat on the bones too, okay? Again, we're actually talking about a long period of time when you look at the reality of desegregation of schools here in Texas, as well as in most of the South. The 1954 Brown decision sort of prompted massive resistance to desegregation. So much so here in Texas that the Attorney General went after the NAACP. He subpoenaed their membership lists. He made it illegal for African American teachers to be members of the NAACP. He accused the NAACP of barratry. There's a lawsuit that the NAACP had to fight in Tyler because of the desegregation case, or because of Brown. The state legislature passed legislation in 1956, again 2 years after the Brown decision, in which each school district in the state had to have a desegregation vote. For example, here in Dallas, when they did the desegregation vote in 1957, it lost 2/3 to 1/3. And so indeed, it was a long process to actually desegregate the schools. And again, I mentioned that they closed a lot of the Rosenwald schools across the state. So as I said, in many cases, students literally did have to wait then to find a place where they could go to school here in the state of Texas. South Carolina did something really interesting. They saw desegregation coming. So in 1951, they appointed a committee called the Gressett Committee, in which a state legislator had to come up with a way to equalize all of the black schools with the white schools. And now that was going to take some money to get it done. So they passed a 3% sales tax to begin to equalize the black schools with the white schools in South Carolina. So they never were able to achieve it, but they at least tried. But finally, they eventually gave up 1959 and 1960 and allowed desegregation to take place.
I'd like to turn a little bit to personal connections with these schools. Could we start with you, Grover, with these questions? Sandflat was known for its exceptional educators and high standards. The strong foundation you received there sparked your lifelong passion for learning and later for teaching. Can you share your thoughts on how the school attracted teachers and what inspired them to set you up for success?
You know, it's hard to say what inspired some of those teachers. And first of all, I want to point out one thing. I have one of my teachers there, the last living teacher at the Rosenwald School, Miss Pope, Miss Shamian Pope. And I asked her about it, what inspired you? And she basically told me the story of her brother working with some of the people from Rains County and knowing that they had needed a teacher. And so, she was looking for a job as a teacher, and so she was hired through knowing someone. And I'm glad that happened that way, because Miss Pope was, I consider, the best teacher that I ever had. And I'm going to tell you why. It wasn't so much about the book learning that she taught us. This was 1968, the year before schools desegregation in Rains County. She told us that when you go to the school in Rains County, in Emory, and put it this way, when you go to that white school, you're not going to get any black history. You're going to be written out. And so she said, so before you go there, we're going to do black history. And what I found out about doing that, of course, I learned a little bit later that she didn't just teach black history. She taught a little bit of self-awareness, self-pride. She taught. And basically, when you get older and you think about those things, then you really come to realize how much dedication that teachers had. Think about it. Emory, Texas was a small town. At that time, I think it was 956 people. At least that was what was on the sign. And it was probably less than that. And we had teachers from, Miss Pope came from Honey Grove. And we had teachers from Tyler. They didn't drive back and forth to Honey Grove and to Tyler every day. They would stay in the Masonic Lodge had built an apartment. And they would stay there the entire week. Now, I always say they couldn't have been teaching for the money, because they didn't get paid as much as white teachers did. So it had to be for the children. And I think that dedication to education of us sparked that light, that flame in me to want to teach, to want to coach, and to do a number of things. And so, she's one of, all of those teachers are unsung heroes. And I'm just so happy that Ms. Polk is here, and I'm just happy that she's here. She deserves her flowers.
Sounds like maybe they sensed that the time was right to really start investing in you kids because there was change coming. I have a question for anyone on the panel. Sand Flat was one of the last Rosenwald schools to integrate. Why do you think this was the case?
I'm not sure. You said it was one of the last Rosenwald schools to integrate?
That's what my notes say.
Yeah. Yeah.
When, in 1965, when I went to Rains High School, that particular year, there were so many of the other rural schools that closed as well. And those students went to what had been the white high schools. So I'm not sure how Sand Flat would have been one of the last when there, for example, my class at St. Paul, there were probably students in my class from at least maybe 10 different communities. And so it was a whole lot of schools that closed that year. And that was my senior year. And I had senior classmates all over that graduated from other schools. So that question I don't really understand.
Again, there were two school districts in Rains County at one time. There was Point School District and, of course, Emory School District. The Rains Comprehensive School District didn't come about until 1970. But prior to that, you had the two separate school districts. Point has a black community called Richland, and they went to a Rosenwald school in Richland. So they actually, Richland Elementary, actually went to Rains School District before we did. So we were the last, but there's a reason for that. The other part of the story is that they were building a new school, brand new school, between Point and Emory, and Sand Flat didn't close down until that new school was built, and when it was built in 1970, right at 1970, that's when we fully integrated Rains Independent School District, because it encompassed Point and became Rains Comprehensive School District. So that was when, like I said, when we were fully desegregated. It was 1970.
Dr. Delaney, do you have any insight into the pressure of desegregation on some of the more rural communities, as Gwendolyn mentioned, sort of consolidating into other communities?
I see Gwendolyn wants to say something. Go ahead.
No, not on that. I was, go ahead and speak on that.
Well, we typically look when we look at school desegregation, we look at the major cities, and what we don't look at is those rural schools in any depth and in any detail, because they're sort of outside of where the major action was happening, such as in New Orleans and Little Rock and Dallas and Birmingham and Montgomery. In the rural schools, again, the main thing that happened, as I've sort of said already, was that they literally did shut those schools down, and so that you lost a lot of the Rosenwald schools. And in many cases, it forced African American students to migrate to the cities, to in fact to figure out ways to catch buses to the cities. when the NAACP began in its campaign in 1935 to try to integrate the public school systems in the South. One of the major things they asked for was for buses so that students could get from those rural areas, again, after the closing of the rural schools, specifically the Rosenwald schools, to the cities. In order to get some type of education that now they were no longer able to get because of the closing in the schools in the rural areas.
I'd like to speak to that just for a moment. The Sandflat School only went to the 8th grade. So prior to 1965, students in Emory, they went to Sandflat through the 8th grade, but then they went to St. Paul High School, which was located between Greenville and Commerce. And we rode a bus to high school every day. And that bus ride was actually, if you weren't riding the bus, it was about 40 minutes away. But I got on the bus in Emory. My two best friends back there, Hella Mayberry and Lois Lane, we picked them up in Point. The bus went through Lone Oak, picked up people, went outside of Greenville, sometimes to Campbell and some other little communities. So we had a very long bus ride every morning and every afternoon. When St. Paul shut down in 1965, Raines had not accepted us. So we didn't know where we were going to go my senior year. My father was the principal at Sandflat, and he was trying to work with Miller Grove. That doesn't mean anything to you, but Miller Grove was a small white town, and he was working with them to see if they would accept us. And it was looking like they were going to accept us, but then Raines did accept us. So that was a very strange year.
Let me address the bus issue a little bit more too, because buses were very, very important in southern school districts, because in many cases, even though again there were these schools in the rural areas, in many cases there was only one school in the whole county that all African American students had to attend. And so in many cases there were no buses. So that meant that they could not attend school at all. Of course, one of the most famous civil rights cases, and y'all can look this up on your phones, Briggs versus Elliott, originated because of the lack of a bus in Clarendon County, South Carolina. And the NAACP, the local churches, just begged the school district, the school board, for a bus, and they repeatedly turned them down. So finally, they filed a lawsuit called Briggs versus Elliott, and it became one of the cases that led to the Brown decision in 1954.
I'd like to comment on that briefly. Now, it sounds like I must be about 90. When I tell this, Grover probably doesn't remember this, but Sandflat didn't have a bus for a long time. And my dad, being the principal, he had a panel truck. And he put seats in that truck some kind of way. And the truck served as the school bus. And I can remember I was about 6 years old, my dad, my younger brother, and another man went to Austin to get the school bus. And that was the first school bus. And I hadn't mentioned earlier, but my dad was the principal, the coach, the janitor, school bus driver, the cook. And so those were interesting times. And so I remember before the school bus. So I know about the school buses.
Can I take us back? We're missing some things. Be sure to go see the exhibit because it is really good, and it just misses a couple things. Misses I'll just say the history of black education in this country, and it misses the conflict between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois over the content of African American education in this country. So, and I'm trying not to make this a history lecture, so I apologize in advance. But as you know, after the Civil War, the first things after African Americans did was build schools. Okay, starting with the Freedmen's Bureau, then the churches, the AME Church, the Baptist Church, all of them were building schools. And then, of course, there was the resistance, say, for example, between 1866 and 1876, 600 African-American schools were burnt down in the South by whites because they did not want African-Americans to get education. But they rebuilt them and they kept pushing forward. Then, of course, there was the idea that African-Americans were not cognizant, smart enough to learn. And so they didn't want African Americans to go to school. They wanted them to work in the fields and so on. And then they decided, well, we're going to teach them and educate them, but we're going to educate them in industrial arts, okay, to be bricklayers, painters, plasterers, and carpenters and so on. And of course, Booker T. Washington became the chief advocate of that. We all know that, right? All the African Americans, I'm sure, in the audience know that conflict, that there was the belief that African Americans should not have a liberal education because they weren't smart enough to learn French and mathematics and chemistry and so on. So teach them something that they can do so that they will be productive citizens. And so that became the primary means to educate African Americans. And so Booker T. Washington pushed this at Tuskegee. And so, indeed, when he met Julius Rosenwald, it indeed was perfect that the two of them could come together, because the other side of that was that the South did not want to build schools for African American children, okay? And if they did, they underfunded them. And again, here's a case you can look up, Cumming versus Georgia. It'll tell you how they decided indeed to basically underfund black schools, even though African Americans paid taxes for schools to support the school districts. So Booker T. Washington became the chief proponent of industrial education for African Americans. And W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, had sort of countered that. And again, here's another source for you. Look at the souls of black folk. There's a chapter in there that says, of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, okay? In which he, of course, takes Washington to task for trying to limit the opportunity of African Americans to get an education. So with the Rosenwald schools and the Rosenwald Fund that starts in 1917, it's perfect because the schools are laid out. And one of the things I sort of missed in the exhibition was, where did they put the shop? Where did they put the industrial education part? Where did they put home economics and so on? And so when you look at the layout of the schools, again, particularly in this exhibit, you missed something. And so I kept looking for, where's this shop? Because this is one of the main things that they wanted to do in the Rosenwald schools is teach industrial education and carpentry and home economics. And so, again, take a look at the exhibit when you finish, because as I said, it's very, very, very good. I learned a lot from it when I went through it a few weeks ago. But as I said, it sort of misses these sort of conflicts and these tensions over how do you educate African Americans? Do you indeed allow them to study the liberal arts, or do you indeed limit them to industrial education?
I'd like to make a comment on that to some extent. At Sandflat, there was no place for shop classes and that sort of thing, but there was to 8th grade. At St. Paul, they did have a shop where all of that was taught. They also had a homemaking building at St. Paul where all the homemaking classes were taught. I was homemaker of the year. Another thing I wanted to mention, though, based on what he said about learning, we didn't have African American history per se because we had African American history every day. The school, Sandflat, had a small library. My father went through the books in the library. Wasn't a whole lot of books, but all of the books that were negative, they were banned by my father. There was this book now that's a collector's book, Little Black Sambo. My dad took all of them out of the library. And there were a few others that were along that line that were taken out of the library. But we learned African American history. We learned a lot of things because, like he said, 1st through the 3rd grade were all in the same room. 1st graders often knew the 3rd grade person's lesson because they were all taught in the same room. And so we were advanced in a lot of ways, and jokingly, I used to tell Helen Mayberry, I could have gone from Sandflat to college. I just needed time to grow up.
Let me add to what Gwen was saying. Like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade was in one classroom. I had 3 brothers. I was 1st grade, my brother in 2nd grade, brother in 3rd grade. So there were advantages and disadvantages. And I'll just leave it at that.
Let me comment on the teaching of African American history in segregated schools in the South. Well, one of the interesting things was that Du Bois in 1934, excuse me, I apologize, I'm a historian, so I got to lay out some of this stuff on the basis of the facts. Anyway, in 1934, again, you can find this yourself in the Journal of Negro Education, Du Bois writes an article, Does the Negro Need Segregated Schools? And guess what his answer was? Yes. Because he was arguing that it was in segregated schools where African American children would actually learn their own history. Yeah. Okay, and so indeed, he said, let's keep these segregated schools. Let's not rush to integration because we'll lose something. Okay, then of course there's a new book out. Well, it's published in 2021. Again, I'm giving you some sources here. Jarvis Gibbons has published a book called Fugitive Pedagogy, in which he talks about how black teachers in Rosenwald schools and segregated schools were able to teach black history because indeed just like the Luddites we have today, they didn't want them to teach black history. Okay, you know, there's an anti-woke campaign going across the country, and this fight against critical race theory, which is nonsense. No schools teach critical race theory. So, what Jarvis Givens points out then in his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, I'll give you that title again. He says that indeed most of the southern school districts controlled the curriculum and did not want the teachers to teach what was at that time called Negro history. So the teachers used a book by Carter G. Woodson, The Negro in Our History, and they would keep it in their lap. They would have the curriculum, the racist curriculum in many cases, on the desk, but they'd be teaching out of that Negro in Our History book in their lap in the segregated and in the Rosenwald schools.
My first book report that I ever did in school was Up from Slavery, and I think I was in the 4th grade. That's the first book report I ever did.
Miss Pope, our teacher, again, was there. I like to always give her her flowers. She made sure that we had a notebook. She gave us notebooks, and we had to do a little bit of research on different black figures in history and what they did. And I'll never forget the George Washington Carver. And, you know, everybody said, well, peanut butter, he did stuff with peanut butter. But that's not what he did. He saved the economy of the South because the boll weevil was eating all of the cotton. And so he gave Southern farmers something else to plant, something else to build an economy on. I would have never learned that if it hadn't been for Miss Pope. So we had to keep those notebooks, but that wasn't the only thing. We had to learn about James Weldon Johnson, the Negro National Anthem. She made us learn that. The creation. We all had to recite the creation. There were a number of things that I still remember that she taught. For some reason, I can't forget some of those things. And so, and I think that we never got anything like that once the school desegregated. We didn't. So,
panel, you've all brought up some good examples of how history and the fuller history and identity and community was stronger in these Rosenwald and segregated schools, despite their intention, despite what they were meant to limit. How did you carry those concepts on after integration? How did you pass that on to community and family to keep those strong ties and the truth passed on to generation to generation?
It's kind of like, my parents, my mother and father, my grandparents, they taught us about our own family history. And so that became part of our family history for me, the education about, what the African American experience and the things that we were a part of. So I taught that to my daughter and to my children, and I'm hoping that, that's just spread on. I always tell my daughter too, I say, yeah, that's important, so don't forget it.
Again, in my family, it's a little different. Because my father was the principal, at that particular time, as well as now, I guess, he was the only African American male in the community with a college degree. My grandfather, paternal grandfather, he was somewhat of a philanthropist. He owned a junkyard, and he was a bootlegger. His parents were the first African American teachers in Emory. And because of my family's history in the community, my maiden name, Macmillan, we have a Macmillan Street. There is a bridge on State Highway 19 that's named for my aunt, Mildred Macmillan Garrett, and my family is celebrating its 70th continuous family reunion next month. And so we have really tried to carry on the Macmillan name, the Garrett name, Jackson name, Robinson name. Those are all my relatives. And the book that I wrote in 2009 was basically writing my family's history. And as I wrote my family's history, I realized I could not write my family's history without writing the community's history. And so it started out being genealogy, and then it ended up being history.
I just wanted to make a comment about the Macmillan family reunion. Everybody's invited.
Everybody.
To remind the audience and the panel of some of the numbers of the Rosenwald program, between Rosenwald grants and community fundraising, Texas wound up with 527 buildings in 52 counties, most of them in the eastern half of the state. And that's 464 schools with a 57,330 student capacity, plus 31 teachers' homes and 32 shops. Do you have any thoughts on examples, San Flat and others, how many Rosenwald buildings still stand in Texas? I know the answer, I think, from the Texas Historical Commission. We've only accounted for about 3 dozen out of 527. We hope there's more out there we just don't know about. And who currently owns them, whether it's private individuals, whether it's the school districts, whether it's historical societies. And so what are some of these pressures and conditions that affect preserving these sites?
In 2003, 2001, when there was a survey done of the Rosenwald schools that were standing, it was at that time when the Rosenwald schools were declared, what do you call it?
Most endangered properties, national trust.
Most endangered properties. And so it was at that time that I learned that Rains County really had a treasure in having a Rosenwald school building that was still standing. And I joined the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And several years I went to their national meetings because there was a big push toward recognizing those schools and getting markers, historical markers. So my husband and I attended those meetings. We attended Rosenwald school conferences in several states, and we took it upon ourselves to do just a survey of Rosenwald schools. And from Dallas to Florida, we visited Rosenwald schools in every state. I forgot now how many we visited, but many Rosenwald schools are houses now. People live in them. Some are barns. Some are community centers. Some are still schools. And so it was a very interesting experience seeing the Rosenwald schools. And there was, at that time, a lot of grants that were being given. Home Depot was one of them that was giving large grants. And so that's how I got interested in seeing the Rosenwald schools.
As for me, I lived in Georgia for a long time, and I would come back home, and I'd always stop by, the school, and it was the 50th anniversary of the desegregation in Rains County when I noticed how dilapidated the school was getting. And so I made a few phone calls to friends and to, I think I talked with Gwen for a little bit, and I talked to one of the Rains County judges, and I let him know that, hey, this is an important piece of history. And it's not just an important piece of African-American history, but it's also Rains County history as a whole. I mean, it shows how far that the county has come from segregation to now, full integration. And it's a shame that if we let this building fall. Unfortunately, we were not able to draw enough interest in people to donate and to try to preserve the school. So it eventually fell about 3 years ago. I still go and whenever I'm at home, I still consider Emory home. I go by there, and sometimes I go by there and I cry. But it's a big piece of history, a big piece of our lives. And I just hate to see it. I just hate to see it go away.
I spent 14 years in South Carolina, and for 5 years I was on the South Carolina African American Heritage Commission, and we did a Rosenwald school project there, where we tried to, and I think we did a pretty good job of identifying the remaining Rosenwald schools that were there. Out of about 450, we found 153 buildings still standing. They were community centers, offices, clinics, and about 100 or so, I believe it or not, were still schools owned by the school districts in which they were located. And so we got a National Trust preservation grant to do the project, and I did a lot of the field work with some of the other members of the commission. The commission was more than what a typical commission is, where you meet and you sit around and talk. We actually went out into the field and took photographs and located the schools and so on.
To that point, all of you have experience with not only Sand Flat, but other schools that you've recognized that they are all jewels and they're all something worthy of the whole community of remembering and preserving. How can communities ensure that the stories are passed down along with the buildings, not just through restoration, but through oral history, education? What roles can alumni and descendants of Rosenwald students and anyone here in the audience play in helping with that?
Well, do a Rosenwald school project, as I just said, in terms of getting involved in terms of helping to locate them. First, of course, coming to understand what those schools were and how significant they were in African American educational history. Just one more point. For example, when Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the general counsel for the NAACP 1935 to 1941, decided to look at the state and condition of African American education in the South. He went around and looked at black schools in the South to see if they were truly separate and equal. And of course, most of them were not. In fact, in his report, he basically said only the Rosenwald schools were decent in places that students would want to go to and be educated. He looked at the black schools, specifically in South Carolina and North Carolina, where they were still using outhouses. They didn't have running water in bathrooms and within the school themselves. They didn't have libraries, and so the report that he wrote then in 1935, 1936, that sort of motivated the NAACP to take on their quest to integrate and equalize the schools of African Americans in the South.
I also remember when Sandflat got the indoor restroom. And I'm not 90.
I remember that, and I'm younger than her.
Well, I want to make sure that we have time for the audience to turn in any questions. So if you have questions written in your note cards, hold those up for the staff to find. If you want to take some time to write something, please do that, and we'll start getting those to the panel here. I'm going to start with the first one I see here. Let's see. A question for Ms. Gwen. Did your father's educational experience affect your motivation to succeed in your education?
Yes and no. I can remember as a child, I always said I did not want to be a teacher. And I imagine that that's kind of normal, that children and especially teenagers don't want to be what their parents are. But as I got older, I had a much better appreciation for my father and his education. He was a brilliant man, and I didn't realize his brilliancy until I became a teacher. And so, yes, I was influenced by him a lot.
As a matter of fact, I think every black child in Rains County at that time was influenced by Mr. McMillan. I know for myself that after I left Emory, left Rains County, I went to college, went to the military. Whenever I'd come back, he would be one of the first persons that I would look up and go and talk to. And so it was just he was just more than a teacher. As you got older, he was actually a friend. And he would give you some great advice.
It seems like in many communities, more so than just being an educator, they are a community core that things revolve around, and there's a standard there for how things should be and how things need to be. We run across that in other communities too, and I'm glad that was the case. Here's a question for anyone on the panel. Was there any pushback from state or city officials on the expansion of the Rosenwald program into Texas towns? And did they have any control over these schools?
Would you read that one again?
Well, I mean, the original Rosenwald was built before all of your time, but was there any pushback from state or city officials on the expansion of the Rosenwald program into Texas towns? And did they have any control over these schools?
Well, let me address that. There wasn't pushback per se because the Rosenwald schools let the local school districts off the hook. Again, the community had to raise a third of the funding. They got a third of the funding from the Rosenwald fund. Then the school district literally had to do the upkeep of the building. And of course, they indeed controlled the school because the schools, in most cases, became part of the public school district in the locale in which it was located.
It was interesting what you talked about with Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois, and what you talked about, Ms. Gwen, about the library, because I think that was also part of the Rosenwald program, was to equip the schools, library and other equipment. That, again, was perhaps an increase in standard of what had been there before. Here's a question from the audience. I appreciated Mr. Thomas's story about learning black history before you went to the white school. How can we fight against current educational curriculum policy decisions that deem African American history classes obsolete due to their discussions about racism?
I'll take that one. Some of you know that I've been the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And of course, that was the association was founded by Carter G. Woodson in 1915. And of course, part of his mission was indeed to increase the teaching of what was then Negro history in the public schools, and to make it a discipline and to begin research in the field, and specifically to make sure that African American children learned Negro history. He started Negro History Week in 1926, for example, and by 1931, and with just 5 years, they were celebrating Negro History Week in 80% of the black high schools in the South. And so we have to sort of pick up his mission, pick up his the tradition that he gave us of challenging, as I said, it's sort of the legislation passed by the Luddites in the legislature, and the Luddites, look that one up, and the Luddites in the federal government, by indeed doing all that we can to teach African American history, not only to the black children, but to the whole community. For example, and this is and I'm sorry, this is a scandalous plug here. We do what we're calling freedom schools at the African American Museum every Saturday from 3 to 5 to teach African American history to the community. They're basically, the classes are basically free, but that we feel that is one of the ways that we can indeed stop them from trying to make black history, this terrible subject that nobody wants to learn because it makes children feel bad. That's nonsense. And of course, we not only do it here at the African American Museum, but the association has 7 sites where we're doing it across the country as a way of challenging what DeSantis has done in Florida, what Abbott has done here in Texas, and what let me stop. I'm getting too political here, but anyway, we're indeed trying to challenge what is happening, and we're better able to do it than Woodson was able to do between 1915 and 1950 when he was running the association. Now we have all kinds of information on the web. There's books such as Black History 365 that's aimed specifically at high school students. There's films just about every topic in the African American experience. So as I said, there's no excuse now for not teaching African American history. It's easy. When I started teaching, again, I'm going to date myself here. In 1975, there were hardly any maps. There was no internet. And we had to, and I hope there's no one here who's going to put me in jail, we had to pirate videos off of PBS. We had to use what do they call those machines, to run off handouts? Yes, a mimeograph machine. So now, though, it's so much easier to teach just about any subject, but African American history indeed has been really easy to teach because there's so many resources available to do it now.
I have a question here for Bob. Hey, that's me. What is the process for getting a historical marker for Rosenwald schools that no longer exist? Every spring, we take applications for any topic from around the state, and we need about a 5-page double-spaced narrative with reference notes. For those of you who haven't written anything since high school, we can help you with that. You need to pay for it if it's in the spring. It can be $1,500 and it can be $2,500 depending on the size of it. And so that period has just ended May 15th. In the fall, you can try your chance. We take a $100 application fee from all markers in the spring and put into a special fund called Undertold Markers. We've done almost 300 of those, and at least a dozen are Rosenwald schools, and also African American churches and communities and cemeteries. That marker, if you were selected, it would be free, but it's more competitive because we can only do 15 and we get 80 or 90 applications. But that's every fall, October 1st to November 15th. thc.texas.gov and look up markers and look up undertold for the fall and regular markers for the spring. I have a final question so we can wrap up on time. What gives you hope that this history will be preserved for future generations? How can we individually support these efforts to ensure that the history is remembered?
I'll speak on that one. I hate to give a negative answer, but I see little hope for the preservation of the Rosenwald schools. In Emory, the Sandflat School, I don't think that the people that lived there knew what we had. And when the buildings started falling down, a few were affected, but I don't think they were affected in the way that they should have been. And so I see little hope.
With respect to preserving Rosenwald schools, I have to agree with Gwen. But the thing that I don't want to lose sight of are the unsung heroes, those teachers, like Mr. McMillan, Ms. Polk, Ms. McGill, Ms. Wade. All of those were teachers who taught at Sandflat Elementary School. They were hidden figures. And those of us who were students of theirs, who've moved on, if we have to keep what they did alive. We have to make sure that our children know, and that our children's children know about the people. The other thing too is one of the things that schools, Rosenwald schools, especially Sandflat School, was always intertwined with the church. And I think because of what the church did during the Civil Rights Movement, we have to get the church involved in what we do for our own history and for what we need to do for the future. And so I kind of have a little bit of hope there. In my church, we have I'm part of the Justice Ministry, and we do go to Austin and tell our story there. And so, again, a little bit of hope because we don't get a whole lot of movement. So.
Well, I have a lot of hope, because I've seen a lot of change in all the years that I've been teaching. Again, I mentioned earlier that when we did the project in South Carolina, of course, 2/3 of the Rosenwald schools were gone, but we put markers on some of them. We did the conferences. I think I may have seen you at one of the National Trust conferences, but I'm not going to date us. But so I have a lot of hope that we can preserve the ones that we've identified. In fact, I even got a prop here. The report we did in South Carolina on the schools, we published it, we circulated it, we did a national register of historic sites handbook for teachers in the schools. So we've done all kinds of things to get the information out. So as I said, a lot of hope that things will change.
Well, panel, I want to thank you all for what you've shared tonight. And I'm going to invite Mary Pat Higgins to come back on the stage and close us out.
Let's see. This on? Thank you. Thank you so much, Marvin and Gwendolyn, Grover, and Bob. Thank you so much for this conversation, for being here, for sharing your history with us. We are so fortunate to have the African American History Museum in our community, and I hope you all will go and visit that. And I also want you to know that we teach African American history in our museum too, in our Pivot to America gallery. So if you haven't been up there, please go up and explore that gallery, and you'll learn not nearly as much as the African American Museum, but there is some history there. I take hope in the inspiration of upstanders like Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who came together to try to solve a critically important issue that our country was facing. And I think we could all learn from their lesson, working across the aisle, so to speak, or across barriers, and try to solve some of the problems that our country is facing today. I'm editorializing, but I wanted to share with you all, I grew up in Austin, and there's a gentleman in the audience that went to my high school. We actually, in 1980, Austin was still dealing with desegregation. I was at a predominantly white school and was bused to a neglected, predominantly African American and Hispanic school. And the shocking nature of that school when we got there showed that there was separate and very not equal. So many years after desegregation, we were still dealing with that issue, and I think we're still dealing with it today. So I hope you'll all be a part of the solution, stand up for what you believe in, and speak out, and come back. We have I'm going to quit preaching. We have 2 more programs and that are part of this exhibition. On July 8th, we're partnering with Project Unity for a Together We Dine. If you haven't done that, I highly recommend it. It's an incredible experience. It's almost sold out, so if you're interested, go home and register tonight. And then the final program is on August 12th, when we'll host Kenneth Morris, a great-great-grandson of both Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, in conversation with Stephanie Deutsch, the wife of the great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald. They will discuss their ancestors' shared vision of a brighter future. We all need to come and learn from them, so I hope I see you then. The exhibit will be open till 9, so if you haven't gone through, please stay with us and enjoy, and otherwise come back, and it's open until August 17th. Thank you. Good night.